This video is sponsored by Shiro Games. Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're taking a look at the all-new Dune Spice Wars, the real-time 4X game set in the Dune universe that just released into early access. If you're interested in learning more about the game beyond this video or picking it up for yourself, don't hesitate to check out the link in the description and pinned comment down below. Dune Spice Wars has quite a few unique elements to it, between the iconic setting, the asymmetry between the factions, and a fairly different approach to each of the 4Xs in 4X. This Essentials guide, with timestamps down below for you to jump between topics as needed, should give you everything you need to wrap your head around the game's complexities and make the spice-rich planet of Arrakis yours. 4 unique factions. First things first, Dune will have you choosing from one of 4 factions to play as, each having their own twist on some of the core game mechanics, and each faction having a choice of 4 counselors from which you can pick 2 based on how they'll impact your approach and overall strategy. These counselors might provide access to additional gameplay mechanics, they might buff your military or your economy, or they might provide tools to use against other factions. While the counselors might influence the finer points of your approach, the faction you choose to play as will have much bigger implications, as you might imagine. If you're interested in a deep dive into each faction, let me know in the comments down below, and we can dig into them in future videos, but in the interest of covering broader strokes today, we'll be doing a quick overview of the 4 for now. House Atreides is able to take a less militaristic approach at times, as it's able to expand its influence without the need for violence, instead annexing villages using the influence resource on top of the authority resource, water, and a little bit of extra time. I'll explain this in more depth in a bit, but it translates to keeping your soldiers out of harm's way until needed, or at the very least, having another option to spread your influence beyond fighting for it. House Harkonnen is the more militant of the factions, with slightly more powerful units and access to the use of corruption, though it comes at the cost of a weaker economy with a lower output. They can, however, use oppression on villages under their control to temporarily bolster their output, and their unique tech tree elements focus on reduced military recruitment and upkeep costs, and the use of fear tactics to reduce how much authority it costs to acquire a village. The smugglers take advantage of some of the more unique mechanics in the game, and they seem to take advantage of harassment and guerrilla tactics particularly. Some of their units focus on not just reducing enemy health, but causing their supply to drop too, and enemy units with low supplies are susceptible to more damage from specific smuggler units, while also being more susceptible to damage over time from the environment should they completely run out of supplies. Again, something I'll explain in more depth in just a minute. On the defensive side of things, some smuggler units are also able to heal mid-battle as long as they kill a single enemy unit at least. This is completely unique to them, as all other factions need to bring units to friendly regions in order to heal them. Finally, by building underworld headquarters in villages owned by other factions, smugglers are able to acquire resources, cause damage, heal, or otherwise take advantage of territory that doesn't belong to them, needing minimal upkeep or maintenance for decent returns. The Fremen, natives of Arrakis, have quite a few advantages of their own as the only ones who acquire spice without the use of harvesters, using spice collectors and harvesting teams instead, never having to worry about sandworms interrupting their work, and they have access to some great mobility right off the bat. Unlike other factions who need to build airfields for transportation, Thumpers allow the Fremen to harness desert power and travel great distances on the backs of sandworms, practically teleporting from their starting location to a previously explored destination up to a certain reasonable distance. They can transport multiple units at a time, and though the Fremen only start with 3 Thumpers, they'll start passively generating more in due time, unless you're playing particularly poorly. No matter your faction of choice, there are a few key elements that apply across the board, so let's dive a little deeper into some of these topics. The local friends, foes, and fauna. Apart from engaging in diplomacy with the other major factions, looking perhaps to trade resources or establish longer-term treaties, you'll be contending with Arrakis itself. The planet, also known as the titular Dune, is a largely barren and dangerous landscape with a native population that doesn't take too kindly to being subjugated, but whose subjugation is the key to your success. The first thing you need to do as any faction is scout, and you need to do so aggressively. The map is split up into regions, and resources can only be produced in these regions outside your headquarters, sometimes exclusively in specific regions based on the availability of certain raw materials within the region's boundaries. I'm speaking specifically about spice, a crucial resource from start to finish. Regions might also have additional points of interest that provide technology, units, or additional resources, and while you can exploit these points of interest in a few ways as determined by the nature of the point of interest itself, if you want to build in a region and exploit its natural resources or otherwise improve your faction's capabilities, you first need to acquire the village in said region. Doing so requires you to first scout them out, and by telling your ornithopters to investigate the question marks littered across the desert, you're bound to come across them. They're almost always on top of this more rocky-looking texture though, so feel free to prioritize scouting these specific points of interest first. Once you've located a village, you can try and take it in a few ways. Sending military units over to take out the local militia is always an option, and the number next to the village's name will let you know how many militia units you'll be facing. While the militia is typically made up of weaker units, don't underestimate them too much. Once you've eliminated the militia, you can opt to conquer or plunder the village, and if it previously belonged to another faction, you can simply liberate it instead, returning it to a neutral state, hurting your enemy's economy without adding more to your own plate. Annexation, whether peaceful or not, will take a few resources to perform, including the variable authority, with it costing more authority the further out the village is located from your headquarters and made cheaper through the unlocking of specific technology, among other elements. When picking villages to get and in what order, consider the resources available in the region, as you can only exploit a resource if you have control of the village in the same region. Separately, you might want to consider the specific buff a village might give you, as shown here when you've got one selected. And you might want to consider the wind speed in the region too, as it directly impacts how much water you can generate in the region, as we'll discuss in just a second. Villages you conquer will eventually need defending, and you can build military buildings to do so, or you can station units in the area, or you can recruit militia of your own. These defenses won't just protect the village from other factions, but from local raiders as well. These raiders will attack from time to time, trying to liberate villages under your control, and as they do so repeatedly, they'll eventually reveal where they're coming from for you or somebody else to take out. You'll also occasionally come across the sieges of Arrakis. These are hideouts carved into mountainsides that have a significantly more powerful garrison and can be traded with in order to build better relations and alliances if you're so inclined, and some factions gain extra benefits from these alliances. Apart from the people of Arrakis, the climate itself is something of an enemy. Sandstorms occur from time to time, and though you can hide in sieges to keep units safe, you might be best off fleeing from regions affected by the storms, as they're likely to damage or completely destroy units. The final local element you'll need to concern yourself with is perhaps the most iconic of Dune references: the sandworm. From time to time, you'll get a notification if a sandworm has been spotted in regions with any of your units in them. You'll see them moving under the surface, and units in danger of being attacked by the sandworm will have a warning over their head, and you'll want to react quickly unless you want said unit to be eaten. It doesn't matter if they're full health or if they're your most elite unit. The sandworm doesn't discriminate. Harvesters need to be recalled, bringing them back to your refineries and stopping the production of spice. Keep an eye out for the movement under the sand though, for when it stops, you'll want to immediately send your harvester back out so the spice can keep flowing. The Fremen don't use harvesters, so they don't have to worry about this. As for units, you need to either get them onto the hard surface that villages can be found on, as the sandworm doesn't seem to be able to penetrate the harder rock surface, or you want to just take them out of the region as soon as possible entirely. You need to be pretty quick about it though. You don't have as much time as you might think. The only people that can actually use the sandworm for any benefit are the Fremen who, as explained previously, can use thumpers to help quickly transport units over long distances. But whether you're Fremen or foreign, the sandstorms and smaller villages are common enemies across the board as you try and establish your strength. On which note, powering your economy. The spice must flow, this much is known, but so too must the Solari, the Plascrete, the water, and much more besides. There are a few major resources that you'll need to keep your eye on rather consistently, and there are equally important secondary resources that come in handy for political plays and espionage. The spice is one of the most crucial aspects of your economy, uniquely available on the planet Arrakis, but essential to the Imperium of which House Atreides and Harkonnen are a part. It is a vital resource without which you'll start to suffer trouble. Though it only has a few direct uses for you as the player, one of those uses is to pay the Imperial tax as House Atreides and Harkonnen, or to pay bribes as the smugglers and the Fremen. This is a periodic and ever-increasing amount of spice you have to surrender, and should you not have the amount you need when it's asked of you, you'll miss out on advancements and start falling behind as far as your chances of winning is concerned. Spice is acquired using harvesters from refineries, or as Fremen harvesting teams from spice collectors, and these can only be built at villages in regions with spice deposits, which is why you'll want to scout them out and claim them before your opponents can. Whether using harvesters or collectors, either will generate similar amounts of spice, and this rate of generation can be bolstered for both by adding crew at the cost of manpower. Fremen never have to stop acquiring spice, though other factions will occasionally need to call harvesters back should sandworms threaten their operation, as mentioned previously. Just as you'll want spice to pay your taxes and bribes, you'll need Solari to fund your construction, recruitment, and upgrades. Solari is money. It makes the world go round, and it can be generated in a few ways, with the sale of spice being the primary and most potent. You want to keep an eye on the conversion rate listed here. This changes every so often, and if the conversion rate is low, you might be better off stockpiling your spice and then starting to sell it when the conversion rate is better. The remaining resources are a fair bit simpler. Plascrete is needed to build and maintain buildings and unlock additional building slots at villages, and it's acquired through the Plascrete factory that you can build at any village you control, though having minerals in the same region will buff production. Manpower is needed to bolster spice harvesters and collectors, and it's needed to recruit new units and militia as well. The number here is primarily increased through building the right military buildings, and villages with specific buffs might add to the number too. Fuel cells are needed to build and maintain certain essential buildings, as well as vehicles like ornithopters and some higher level military units too, and these are produced at the fuel cell factory, which can be built at any village you control, though they perform better in regions with energy sources. Water is another essential resource. It's used to recruit and pay upkeep for units and villages alike, and it's acquired through villages with special buffs or by farming the wind with the wind trap building. You can build this around any village you control as well, but as mentioned previously, regions with higher wind speeds can generate more water. Running out of water can cause villages to rise up in rebellion, so keep an eye on your water levels constantly. As you can see, apart from spice, which can only be acquired in regions where it is present, most resource production buildings can be established at any village you control, but you'll want to keep in mind the buffs to production from resources within those regions to help decide which buildings you prioritize at which village, especially since building slots are limited and buildings themselves can be quite expensive. Beyond constructions in the desert, keep in mind construction you can pursue at your headquarters to buff the production of these resources, as well as others we'll be discussing in just a moment, and don't underestimate the value of bolstering production rates or reducing consumption rates by pursuing the right technologies. Either way, these are all core resources that you need to keep your faction alive and operational on Arrakis while staying in the good graces of the Emperor by paying your taxes and bribes. The remaining resources have to do with politics and espionage. Dune has always been about much more than just open war, and engaging in political theater and fighting from the shadows are equally important in Dune Spice Wars as a result. Your political power is represented through authority, hegemony, votes, and influence. Authority is acquired in a variety of ways, though the one you have easiest and most direct control over is through the infiltration of Arrakis. Assigning agents in the espionage screen to focus on Arrakis, you can generate at least 1 point of authority per assigned agent. There are developments you can pursue to further bolster the rate of production, and with enough accumulated, you can spend authority to establish treaties with other factions or to annex other villages, either militarily or diplomatically, regardless of the faction you're playing as. The cost of annexing a village is determined by a few factors, including its distance from your headquarters, who currently controls it, and any developments you've researched that help bring the cost of annexation down. Authority can also be used to counter the use of Lady Jessica by House Atreides, who is able to force treaties through her special abilities as a counselor. Your Landsrat standing represents your standing amongst the great houses of the Imperium, available only to House Atreides and House Harkonnen, and the higher it is, the more benefits you get across the board to elements like resource production, while when it gets particularly low, you suffer debuffs instead. Your Landsrat standing can be improved using agents, costing a significant amount of intel and influence to perform the political audit mission. Hegemony, meanwhile, is a representation of your control over Arrakis, and as it crosses certain thresholds, you'll gain access to more abilities unique to your faction, as highlighted when you were choosing between them. If you ever want a refresher, clicking on your leader portrait will show you what you and your opponents are working towards. Hegemony is also one of the ways to win the game, if you reach that 25,000 mark. Now, might sound like a lot, but hegemony is hugely beneficial along the way, and you attain it pretty naturally over time. With that said, you'll want to try and break that 5k threshold as soon as possible to get some of those juicy benefits early on, so make sure you conquer regions early on, stay on top of your tax and bribe payments, try to grab special regions, build craft workshops where you can, and try to engage neutral villages for the sake of killing their militia, even if you're not going to be conquering the village itself. These are the easy moves to make. Getting resolutions passed is a bit more unpredictable, as we'll discuss in a bit. Improving your Landsrat standing takes a bit more effort, as discussed previously. Acquiring Chom shares requires quite the investment from your agents, but has a significant payoff, and acquiring charters is more of a long-term goal. Separate from the top bar, you'll find knowledge that helps progress your technological developments, bolstered by research hub buildings, influence and votes that can be used to trade for peaceful annexations as House Atreides, and to vote at the Landsrat Council, and agents and intel needed for special missions you can perform and interacting with certain points of interest. Tech trees are pretty self-explanatory, separated into categories, and pretty similar across the board, though each faction will have some unique technology as indicated by their icon on the technology in question. The Landsrat Council is a bit more complicated. As you pass certain resource thresholds and perform specific actions, you'll be able to take hold of charters that increase your hegemony while giving you various additional benefits too, and if you manage to attain and hold Dune governorship for 60 days, you're officially recognized by the great houses as the ruler of Arrakis, granting you a political victory. Apart from these charters, the Landsrat meets periodically to vote on resolutions. On the lead up to this meeting, you'll see what resolutions are going to be voted on, allowing you to plan what resources you want to keep in hand for when the time comes. And when the time does come and voting begins, you'll be able to cast your votes and use your reserved influence to either say yay or nay, or in specific cases, target the other major factions or yourself with the effects of a resolution, depending on what each of the resolutions might entail. As the smugglers, you can instead put a bounty on how you'd like people to vote, paying Solari to those who do so, and the effects, whether they're buffs or debuffs, last until the next vote, and they can make a significant difference to militarist, expansionist, and economic developments alike, sometimes bolstering production of relevant resources, other times reducing the efficiency of troops, so on and so forth. So you'll want to use your votes and your influence, regardless of which faction you're playing as, to try and get the little benefits and to try and force the debuffs on your opponents as well, especially those that might be getting ahead of you. Apart from your votes that are a constant and don't actually get drained through use during voting, influence can be used to bolster your votes or in place of votes entirely in the case of Fremen, though influence is actually drained when doing so and needs to be generated at listening posts using technology, trade, or espionage. Espionage is unlocked when your first agent becomes available to you, only a matter of time, and it allows you to assign said agent across a variety of points of infiltration, gleaning a variety of benefits from each. Each agent will have traits that determine the extra benefits they provide when assigned to a task, and if you don't like what they are, you can always dismiss an agent by right-clicking on them. If they were previously assigned to a task, you need to right-click to get them off the task first, and then right-click again to dismiss them entirely. Counterintelligence is helpful if you feel like you're being targeted, or if you'd like to generate more command points for a larger army, as I'll explain in the next section. Outside of counterintelligence, Infiltration levels are gained across the various areas over time as agents are assigned to a specific area, and the higher levels of infiltration will unlock more options. Infiltrating an enemy faction reveals details about their resources, which counselors they're using, what units and territory they have, so on and so forth, as you gain infiltration levels. Eventually, you can use these higher infiltration levels to assassinate their leaders too. Infiltrating Arrakis, the Spacing Guild, Chom, or the Landsraad will help generate various resources, and no matter what you're infiltrating, you'll generate intel over time. This intel is then spent to activate missions listed to the right, with each mission having prerequisite resource requirements including intel and sometimes Solari or influence, and almost always needing at least one level of infiltration in at least one relevant area. These missions take time to charge up, but once they do, you're able to quickly use them as needed. For example, you might want to keep a supply drop in your back pocket and only use it in the middle of a forward push to replenish your troops when the enemy doesn't expect it. You might want to use gear sabotage in a similar way, weakening the enemy in a region as you attack them. Chom shares and political audits are a little different, as explained previously, but each of these missions have their uses depending on the approach you have in mind. Now there is one more resource to talk about, and it segues us directly into military matters. While political plays and espionage are great ways to heat the iron, it's still your military that must strike while said iron is hot. Each faction has access to a handful of unique units alongside some extras that they can get through Landsraad charters and resolutions. These units cost a combination of the previously mentioned resources to produce and maintain, but they also take up some command points. Think of command points like you would population cap in an RTS. You can increase it through military technology, counterintelligence, and the construction of a command post at your capital. Each unit takes up a different number of command points, and more recruitment slots can be opened up with the recruitment center at your headquarters, but there is a fairly tight limit, which means you're balancing these two limitations as well as resources and upkeep costs as you expand your military or disband troops you no longer need. Higher level troop types are unlocked through military technology, and whether you're looking at melee or ranged units, there are a few vital stats to consider alongside special abilities that are highlighted when hovering over the unit type. The stats in question are health, power, and armor. Health is pretty self-explanatory. When this runs out, a unit dies, and if it's running low, you'll want to return the unit to friendly territory to heal it up. Power determines damage output of a unit, while armor lets you know how much of received damage is reduced per hit. Only specific units can strip another of its armor, and they're marked as demolition teams. One more aspect you can only see once a unit is actually recruited is supply. As you can imagine, fighting in hostile terrain means having to keep a close eye on your supply, and it drains rather quickly. Windier regions will drain supply faster, and you might want to use that to your advantage as you choose how to move through the deserts. When a unit runs out of supply, it'll start taking a significant amount of damage over time, and it can absolutely end an offensive push if you miscalculate how much supply you have and how much you'll need. This is where airships and sandworm riding comes in handy, allowing you to cover great distances without supply loss to start your attacks or retreat from them if necessary. Resupplying can only be done by standing close to a village that you control, or, in the case of the smugglers, that you've established a specific type of underworld building at. But make sure you're actually standing close enough in either case to regenerate supply. While units will heal in friendly territory regardless of where they're standing within said friendly territory, supply requires them to be near a held village specifically. When going on the offensive, keep in mind that you can attack buildings as well as a village itself, but be prepared to deal with the militia at the village as well as any defensive forces your enemies might send over. It can be a challenge, especially if there are missile batteries in the area or if the enemy headquarters are close, providing missile support as well. You can use these to your own advantage too though. Your own missile batteries can fire into an engagement from a region you hold into regions you don't, and when you're conquering villages closer to home, sometimes you can bait the militia close enough to your headquarters that you can get a little support from home. Either way, when on the offensive, should you capture a village from an enemy faction without destroying the buildings around it, you'll be able to keep and use those buildings, but if you'd rather just cause damage to your enemy's economy, you can absolutely target the buildings specifically and then just leave instead. Successfully assaulting a village will allow you to take it for yourself at the cost of some resources, liberate it to make it neutral once again if somebody else was holding it, or plunder it for resources, causing devastation in your wake. Using some soldiers to harass on one end while sending the bulk of your army in a different direction is a viable tactic, forcing your enemy to dedicate units on a front before they realize your ruse, and certain factions have access to stealth, making this a more viable strategy even when ornithopters are scouting overhead. Keeping your long-lived veteran units alive is a great idea as well, as experience over time will help buff units, and if you're constantly destroying your enemy's units and keeping your own alive, you'll find yourself having a huge advantage over time on the battlefield. There are many clever faction-specific tools available across the 4 factions, and if you're interested in learning more about them, let me know in the comments down below, and I might go ahead and make a few faction-specific videos highlighting each of their special mechanics, strategies, and units alike. For today's video though, I think this is where we'll call it. Dune Spice Wars is a complex game with a lot of moving parts, each quite interesting to engage with, and each important for different kinds of victories, through political power or military domination alike. I hope this video helps you get a handle on Dune Spice Wars, and remember, if you'd like to learn more about the game or pick it up for yourself, you can do so at the link in the description and pinned comment down below. If you have any thoughts of your own, feel free to share them in the comments, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask away. I'll answer what I can. If you're looking for folks to play multiplayer with when the option is made available, don't hesitate to join our Discord linked in the description, and as always, for more strategy gaming content, don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel. Feel free to check out the video I've linked on screen to see what other exciting titles are releasing this year, and as always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly, and of course, a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.